Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about one of the most bizarre and revealing stories to come out of Russia since the war in Ukraine began, because Russia has now passed a law allowing its central bank and its largest bank, Sberbank, to arm staff and shoot down drones. And no, this isn't satire. This is not a comedy sketch that I put together. It's not some sort of strange internet gag. This is an actual law that's now been passed by the Russian parliament. So if you just think about that for a moment, the people who normally spend their days setting interest rates, processing mortgages, moving cash around the economy and managing inflation in Russia may now also be responsible for operating anti-drone defense systems. And they can apparently be armed whilst doing it. That tells you something very important about where this war is heading, because this is no longer just a war being fought in trenches and on battlefields. This is now a full-on economic war, and Ukraine has increasingly shifted its strategy away from trying to match Russia tank for tank and missile for missile towards attacking the Russian economy itself. Oil refineries, fuel depots, ports, railways, airfields, industrial plants, and now apparently even parts of the Russian banking system are considered vulnerable enough that Moscow thinks they may need armed protection from drones. That is extraordinary. And the really interesting thing here is that this is not the first law that Russia has passed recently like this. In fact, what we're now seeing is the gradual militarization of large parts of the Russian economy. And I don't think enough people are talking about how significant that actually is. Now, before we get into the details on all of this, could I ask anybody that hasn't subscribed yet to please hit that red subscribe button? Do it now. It only takes a second. It's not really a subscription. It doesn't cost you anything. It just shows that you like the channel, and it does help me with the algorithm. So let's break down exactly what's happening. The Russian State Duma has passed legislation allowing the Central Bank of Russia, Sberbank, and the Russian Cash Collection Association and the Special Postal Service, which handles classified state correspondence, to deploy their own anti-drone systems around buildings and facilities. Staff can reportedly be armed to operate these systems directly without waiting for the military or special forces to intervene. But the really important detail here is this: they have to pay for it themselves. The Russian government is basically saying, you sort it out, you pay for it, you defend yourselves. And the wording from the head of Duma Financial Committee was actually remarkably blunt. He basically said, if it's the central bank pays. If it's Sberbank, Sberbank pays. In other words, the state is shifting the cost of the war onto businesses and institutions. And this appears to be happening right across the economy. Now, the timing of this law is not coincidental. Just days before this legislation was passed, Ukrainian strikes reportedly hit the central bank building in Sevastopol in Crimea. And that's important because it sends a message. Ukraine is increasingly demonstrating that nowhere is entirely safe anymore. Not refineries, not ports, not oil depots, not military airfields, and now potentially not financial infrastructure either. And once you start forcing banks to think about drone defense, you know something fundamental has changed, because this law is part of a much bigger pattern. Back in March, Russia also passed another law allowing private security companies protecting critical infrastructure to use firearms against drones. Now, this is important because according to Russian lawmakers, around 80% of Russian fuel and energy infrastructure is protected by private security firms rather than the military. So we're talking about oil refineries, gas facilities, pipelines, electricity infrastructure, transport hubs, basically the backbone of the Russian economy. And these guards were previously heavily restricted in terms of what weapons they were allowed to use. But now they can apparently receive firearms from the Russian National Guard specifically for anti-drone defense. And again, if you think about how extraordinary that is, private guards protecting oil infrastructure are effectively being militarized because of Ukrainian drone attacks. And this isn't theoretical. Ukraine has increasingly targeted Russia's energy system because that's where its money comes from. That's where the revenue is going into the Russian economy. Oil and gas revenues are absolutely critical for the Russian budget and therefore for funding the war. And according to Reuters, Ukrainian attacks knocked out around 700,000 barrels per day of Russian refining capacity between January and May this year across 16 different refineries. Now, that is a huge amount of disruption. Some of the biggest facilities in Russia have been repeatedly targeted. The Tuapse refinery was hit multiple times, Ryazan was hit, Kirishi was hit, Perm was hit. Moscow's refinery has suspended operations on multiple occasions, and Ukraine has increasingly expanded beyond just refineries. Baltic export terminals have been hit, storage depots, pumping stations, rail infrastructure, even facilities in regions previously considered relatively insulated from the war. And this is where Ukraine's strategy has become really interesting, because Ukraine can't outproduce Russia in conventional weapons. It can't simply match Russia shell for shell forever. So instead, it's focused on asymmetrical warfare, low-cost drones attacking high-cost infrastructure. And economically, that creates a nightmare for Russia, because defending a country of its size against relatively cheap drones is incredibly difficult and incredibly expensive. You can't put military-grade air defense systems next to every refinery, every rail hub, every fuel depot, every port, every bank, every pipeline, every power station, and every industrial plant. It's just not possible. And that's why the economic damage goes way beyond the explosions themselves, because companies now have to spend billions defending against attacks that may or may not happen. Russian companies reportedly spent 100 billion rubles on drone defense in 2024 alone, and by 2025 estimates suggest that that figure doubled. Now that is an enormous amount of money being diverted away from investment and productivity. And some of these defense measures are totally surreal. There were reports of anti-drone nets being installed over oil facilities, metal cables stretched around refinery infrastructure, protective mesh systems around fuel tanks, basically turning billion-dollar industrial facilities into giant cages. And in some cases, the drones still got through anyway. One Ukrainian drone reportedly penetrated anti-drone netting protecting an oil storage facility despite all of the defensive measures being put into place. So what you're seeing now is constant economic arms race. Ukraine develops cheaper, longer-range drones. Russia spends billions trying to defend itself. Ukraine adapts again. Russia spends even more. And this is having real-world consequences inside Russia itself. Fuel prices rose sharply last year. Some regions reportedly experienced shortages and supply disruptions, which led to the ban on the export of gasoline and diesel. Russia has repeatedly restricted those exports to stabilize domestic supply, particularly for its farming industry, because without that, they won't be able to actually produce all of the food. Mobile internet blackouts have been increasingly used to interfere with drone navigation systems, but that creates another problem in Russia, because when mobile networks go down, businesses and individuals suffer. Card payments stop working, delivery systems fail, taxi apps stop functioning properly, banking systems become harder to access. So even the defensive measures themselves create economic damage. This is where the story becomes much bigger than just banks with guns, because underneath the absurdity is a very serious issue. The social contract is changing. Traditionally, businesses pay taxes and the state provides security. But increasingly in Russia, the state is saying, the war is your problem too. You need to defend yourselves. You need to pay for the infrastructure. You need to buy the anti-drone systems. You need to hire guards. You need to absorb all of these losses. And that tells us something very important about the strain this war is placing on the Russian economy, because Russia launched this war expecting it to largely remain outside of Russia itself. A short operation, reportedly 1 to 3 days, fought mainly on Ukrainian territory. Instead, the war has slowly come home to Belgorod, to Moscow, to Tatarstan, to oil terminals on the Baltic Sea, to airports, to refineries, to communication networks, and now to the banking system. And I think the symbolism here is incredibly powerful. Russia is one of the world's largest military powers, a nuclear power, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, a country that projected overwhelming military confidence at the start of this invasion. And now, the central bank apparently needs to pay for anti-drone systems. Sberbank is effectively entering the air defense business, and classified postal workers may now be armed against drone attacks. That is an astonishing evolution, and the irony is impossible to ignore. Russia has spent years attacking Ukrainian civilian infrastructure using drones and missiles. Power stations, heating systems, water facilities, transport infrastructure. And now Ukraine is increasingly using drones to make Russia's own economy feel vulnerable, not necessarily on the same humanitarian scale, but strategically. Ukraine is trying to make this war expensive everywhere. Every refinery now requires protection, every facility requires guards, every company has to think about contingency planning, every regional governor has to think about air defense, every institution has to think about security costs, and every ruble spent defending against drones is a ruble not being spent elsewhere in the economy. That's the hidden danger here, not just the explosions, the fear of future attacks and explosions, the constant need to defend against them, the uncertainty premium spreading across the Russian economy. I think that's exactly what Ukraine is aiming for, not necessarily immediate collapse, not some dramatic overnight victory, but attrition, pressure, rising economic costs, making the war harder and harder to sustain financially, because Ukraine understands something very important. Russia may have superior military firepower, but modern economies are vulnerable, particularly large centralized industrial economies dependent on fixed infrastructure. And that's why this story matters so much, because when a country starts arming bank staff against drone attacks, you know the war is no longer confined to the battlefield. The armed bank teller isn't the punchline, the armed bank teller is the story, because when a nuclear superpower starts preparing its financial system for drone warfare, something has gone very, very wrong. But hopefully you found today's video useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking, got you thinking in a different way. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already.